interested in leveling up your leadership, maybe if you like a little bit of history too, then this video is for you. We're going to look at career development theories through history. And I know that sounds boring, but we're really going to take the lens of what's relevant, what matters, and ultimately why those matter to you and why they can matter to you as you develop your own leadership style. So if you don't know me, I'm Tina from Move with Courage Careers, and I help values-driven professionals level up to lead outside the box. And I do this through leadership branding, resumes, LinkedIn, interviewing, and one-to-one career coaching. So I was preparing for an event earlier this week, and the event is Find Your Leadership Style. I put it down in the box if you're interested in joining. Love to see you there. And as part of my research, I kind of really got derailed because I was reading about career development theories again, and I have already known about it, but I never really took it with this lens as I did this time, because I started thinking about a couple things. The first thing is I was beginning to wonder what was going on in our culture of America at the time when these development theories happen. But also, probably more importantly, I was thinking about, well, what can this mean for a modern day leader, especially the type of people that I work with that are refining and trying to be the best version of themselves as leaders. So with that in mind, I'm going to just do a little bit of a timeline for you of leadership theories. So here we go. You ready? We begin with the trait theory. This is in the 1900s. I'm guessing, the industrial age happened. We're just now in factories and sort of systematized workplaces are there. And the trait theory says that, you just have to be born a leader. So if you're not born a leader, you're just out of luck. That's it. And, that's it's not very flexible. There's not a lot of room to grow there. But I thought about that, how sometimes I have clients and they're already leading and they don't realize it. Or I know that they would make wonderful managers and directors. And when I talk to them about it, they say, you know what? I wasn't born to do that. That's not me. I'm not a leader. And they end up being right because they never take actions to do that. And they're stuck in that position of never being a leader. So that's kind of interesting. So this time period is about 1900 to 1940s. Also in this time, they defined actually a couple of different leadership types. And that was the autocratic or the dictator type, the democratic leadership type, and the laissez-faire leadership type. And that was around, of course, World War I, World War II with the rise of fascism. And they were starting to really consider how leaders can impact groups of people. Then we have 1940 to 1950, the behavioral theory. And this is a bit of progress. So no longer is it, if you're not born a leader, you just can't be one. Now it's, guess what? There are certain behaviors that leaders do. You can learn to do those behaviors, and that way you can become a leader. And so, there's parts of this that are relevant now, especially when we think about habits that leaders can do, like self-reflection and soliciting feedback. That's true, that a lot of these behaviors are associated with high-end leaders. But, I think the thing we see sometimes is that leaders are evaluated by these behaviors, and they end up performing the behaviors because that's what they're evaluated on. And then that's why we get this sense that corporate America and organizations are fake, because we have people performing these behaviors and they're really kind of detached from their why, from their purpose, from their mission. It's almost like their own career path gets put into the hands of their company. And that's, by design, because we're meant to devote everything to our company, So I think that's an interesting thing to think about whenever we think about that time and the behaviors. And yes, we do want those behaviors, but we also want the behaviors to come from meaning that belongs to us, right? So that we can be empowered in our career path. Okay, now we're in the 60s and 70s, and we have situational and contingency theories. This is, the countercultural movement. They're understanding that things are changing. There's a lot of unrest going on. And so they started to understand that leaders need to adapt. They need to adapt to these changes. My guess is adapting to the different generations that were at work that had different philosophies, maybe even clashing philosophies, and different situations and individual personalities need to be accounted for. And so this one's really relevant now. We call it being agile, being flexible. It's one of the hardest things we can do as leaders is to stay flexible, but still maintain connection with our ideals and values, but being able to stretch and meet the needs of external factors, different personalities, and a continually changing landscape, especially with all the technology that's happening. So that's an interesting one for me. We get into transformational leadership theory. So this is the 70s and the 80s. I don't really know what was going on that made this happen, in the 70s and 80s. I probably should have researched that more. But basically, they were looking for something a bit above and beyond to what was happening. So if you're a leader, you're not just expected to get results. You're expected to lead and help people to develop. And I would assume also connected to that is to provide purpose. They are generating their own sense of purpose through the environment that you create to help them grow. And so this is a really interesting thing that starts to happen where you are expected to have a vision as a transformational leader because you yourself, you are transformational. You embody transformation. And so everything you do, your habits, your vision, your ideals, you're driving the company, but you're also creating situations where you are developing, where you are nurturing growth in your people. And so it's interesting, we see now, people are trying to be thought leaders, they're trying to be transformational, to be perceived as transformational, to mimic, Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, these guys with the visions. And they've got the first part, which is, you need to have a vision, you need to carry yourself as a role model, you need to embody your values. But they forgot the second piece, which is you then need to use your influence to help others to develop and to grow, because ultimately you're there not to transform yourself, but to transform others. So that's interesting. And I always look to a company that I find to be pretty ethical is Dr. Bronner's. And if you look up, I wrote a blog about this, I can link it, but look up their cosmic principles because they really embody that idea of transformational leadership, developing and growing their people and their community. And also, the next one, servant leadership. This one we hear a little bit more about, I think. This came from the 70s. A guy called Robert Greenleaf wrote a book about it. And the idea is sort of turning the hierarchy on its head. If you are a leader, your first responsibility is to serve. You serve your team, you serve your clients, you serve your community. And it's really sort of the impact of the counterculture movements where they're looking to, act locally, think globally, looking to serve and to make an impact that way. And I think it's a really interesting take. It's a little tricky because if you are a leader, you're usually evaluated on results. And to be a servant leader, your goal is really to elevate others. But the truth is this leader and also the transformational leader done right, they are really well respected. Okay, now we're into the 2000s. We get into the authentic leadership theory. So this is the idea that we are supposed to be transparent. We're supposed to be real. We're supposed to be authentic, and we have to do that by lining up our values with our actions. So talk the talk, you got to walk the walk, whatever that saying is. And this is really prevalent still today. We have this idea, it's kind of a buzzword actually, just be authentic, authenticity. But it's really disconnected from meaning, I think, and it's kind of becoming hollow, right? But the interesting thing I'm starting to see is people are really kind of pulling this apart and looking for the nuances, because the truth is that sometimes it's not always safe to be yourself. Sometimes it's not always safe to be exactly, say exactly what you feel or be exactly who you want to be in different situations. So it's that kind of existential question of, how free can we really be in a work community with our truth? Are we safe to be? How much bias exists in my current, workplace? Because the truth is that professionalism, even though some people see it as like a cage, that there are rules, there are moments where professionalism actually prevents bias. It actually kind of protects us, because some of those maybe stronger, controversial pieces are a little bit off the table or a little bit toned down. So it's that idea now, instead of just completely be yourself, find a balance between your truth and what the expectations of whatever work community you're in. That is the professionalism, right? So looking for that balance, and I think the best way to do this, though, is through your values, right? That's the piece that is going to be consistent for you. Okay, then we go into my favorite one, which is also the most broad, which is developmental leadership model. This is interesting because it's connected really to our lives. So as you grow and develop as a human, so does your leadership style. The idea of vertical development, we're constantly evolving and expanding and moving up. And this really takes into account for all those things that happen outside of your career that maybe you aren't able to talk about in the workplace, but that impact you deeply, So family changes, life changes, health changes, getting older and understanding we're not going to be here forever. All those pieces are huge, and they impact us in very profound ways, and they advance us along our leadership development levels. So that's also, that means this idea of embodied leadership, because you're not just learning it, it's lived. Okay, so that's a really interesting piece. And now the question is, how do you put that into practice? What does that mean? These are big macro ideas. Okay, what am I going to do Tuesday? So here we go. So putting all these pieces together is really asking you to put 125 plus years of thinking and other people's research and other people's lived experience together with your own leadership role models, your own ideas, your own experience in and out of work, your values, what's important to you, where do you want to go, what do you want to do with the rest of your life, and also, if you link back to the developmental leadership theory, where you are on your own developmental path as a human and as a leader. That's ridiculous. That's way too much. That's a lot. So what we're going to do is, instead of doing all of that, we're going to do this in a very organized way, and I've got 4 places to start so that you can implement your new leadership style in the day-to-day. Okay, so here we go. The first one, practice self-awareness and meaning making. So if you've ever seen, they have a list of the top traits of the best leaders, they have them all over. Usually number 1 is self-awareness, and that's because you can't adapt or fix anything if you're not aware of what needs fixed. You can't work on resilience if you're not aware that you're not resilient. So that is usually the number 1 piece, because it also helps with things like managing yourself, managing your emotions, and putting the brakes on so that you can show up in a way that aligns with who you are. The second half of that meaning making, that's all about that developmental piece. That's how we show our growth, is the way that we perceive and match meaning to then our actions, right? So the one thing you can do to practice self-awareness, it's not just something you have or you don't, you really have to practice it, is just become aware by noticing. So if you feel a little tap of something that you feel like maybe you should be paying attention to, pause, notice it first, pause, reflect on it, and then name it. Name the situation, name the emotion, name your own reaction, name, maybe it's your resistance to something, name your intention. Just really spend that time figuring out what that is, and that will help you to start to practice self-awareness. And, then once you are aware of what's driving, your reaction or this situation, then it's going to help you make meaning in a way that's a little bit more objective and connected and measured by who you want to be, which then will help you make a really good action, or the best action that you can muster, right? And so that brings us to the next one. You do need to develop a vision of your leadership. I have 2 pretty good resources I'll put down below. One is to develop your career vision. The other one's to develop your leadership mission. They both work really well here. So, you started to become self-aware by practicing it, and then you're going to need to use that awareness to build your vision of where you want to go. And a lot of times people, of a certain age, mid-career, you start to stomp out your visions and your dreams because that's seen as not practical. But the truth is that's exactly where your inner leader resides, is in the vision and the goals and the encouragement. So if you feel like you are ready to create a vision, it means that your inner leader is actually kind of driving the boat right then. And so this vision is going to depend on your life experiences, your career experiences, your values, what matters to you, who you naturally are, and the impact that you want to have. And so a good starting point, of course, is we're going to keep this really simple, and we're just going to do 3 reflective questions. So think about this. What are you doing in those moments when you're strongest at leadership? What's going on around you? How are you interacting? What needs to happen in order for this situation to be there? And why does that matter? Think about number 2. What are 3, just go very simple, 3 values that matter to you the most? And how can you bring those into your leadership to support you? Think about this. In 5 years, you're going to be your best version of yourself as a leader. Just imagine that. Allow yourself to imagine that. Okay? So what do you look like? What do you sound like? What are your habits? What are your systems? What's your mindset? What role do you have? How do you impact others? Think about those things. And so once you create this vision, it can really start to act as a filter for you to process information, make meaning a different way, and to start making decisions in a way that lines up with who you want to be. The next thing is pretty important because that's where we have to actually experiment. So we've done a lot of thought work. Now we're going to put it into place in the real world. So this is number 3, experiment in small steps. And a lot of times when we think about doing any kind of change work or any kind of development, we have like a really huge goal, and there it is, that's the goal. And then if we don't make a step towards it, we beat ourselves up for not being motivated or being weak. But the truth is that sometimes that goal requires a lot of courage. Sometimes that goal, it sort of brings about a lot of resistance for us because maybe we fear rejection or discouragement or judgment or criticism. And, there's all these things we can have a lot of resistance towards. So the best way is if you scaffold down that big goal into little steps so that you can kind of slowly climb up the ladder and meet the goal in a way that's consistent. Okay, so we think about this next week for you. I want you to choose just one small, tiny experiment in one move. So maybe it's a different way you want to speak. Maybe you want to try to shift your tone a little bit. Maybe you want to put a boundary in place. Or maybe there's some place that you understand somebody on your team, they need a little bit more of a challenge and you should. Maybe this is the time to take a step towards that. So consider that one move you want to make. After you do it, I would also say too, consider how much courage it's going to take you to do that and what resistance you feel. So if you feel a lot of resistance, maybe take it back and make it a tinier step. But anyway, after you do it, then I want you to reflect back what happened. Notice what happened as objectively as you can. Think about if it felt aligned to your vision. Think about if it created the impact that you wanted. And then just sort of refine based on that. Make sure you're not going too critically on yourself here because that can really interrupt things if you are your harshest critic. You can't really get an objective sort of feedback here. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in number 4 too. But really consider what you want to keep for next time, what you want to develop and grow for next time, and maybe change or try. So this is where you're going to fully integrate your self-awareness practices, your leadership vision, and experimentation in the daily. And also you're going to flex, which is the hardest thing that leaders can do, but really stretching outside what you've created to meet the needs of changing situations, external forces that come up that you cannot control, and different personalities that pop up and need different things from you, right? So your goal isn't really to be rigid. We've done a lot of planning and we've done a lot of creating, but now it looks like we are going to stretch ourselves and flex. And the goal is not to be rigid, but to be ready for whatever comes. And that's the real challenge. I think a lot about jazz musicians. People think, oh, they just make it up on the spot. Well, they've practiced for hours in their practice rooms. They practiced all day sometimes. And so whenever that, situation comes up, they're able to take a couple different tools and merge them all together to fit the situation and fit the challenge. So that's the next step, is integrating everything. So if you can, this is where you need to seek feedback from others, trusted people that are going to give you objective feedback from a trusted source. And this is good because it's going to help you to continue to refine. And I think especially if you do have a strong inner critic, you really do need someone objective that might be able to say, hey, listen, that was way better than what you're saying. Sometimes you really do need that. The other piece that's critical is that you need to know your team. You need to know your individuals on your team. You need to know your company and the culture and how it, integrates with the clients and the community. And specifically, you need to know the situation as objectively and as definitively as you can. That's a tricky part, and just try to be aware as you can of all these different contexts, wherever you are, and what it requires from you and what you're actually able to give. Sometimes we can only give so much. We can only do so much and stretch so much. And so this idea of knowing where it is that you need to stretch and flex, being curious about what's going on behind that, and really being curious about yourself and what feels easy, what brings you strength, what drains you, what feels challenging, and what you're currently growing. Sometimes people, they forget 3 or 4 months ago, they were way in a worse situation with maybe their habits or their mindset than they are now. We tend to overlook our own progress. So that's everything. So hopefully you can remember those 4 pieces. Let's go over them again. So number 1 is you're going to be self-aware and consider how you're making meaning. Number 2, you're going to develop a career vision. I've got 2 resources below for you to do that. 3, you're going to experiment in small steps that do not stretch you too much, but stay within the line of where you're headed, and they're consistent steps as well. And number 4, you're going to integrate all of this into real time and challenge yourself to flex to new situations. That's really the tricky part. So if any of that resonates, take it. If any of it doesn't resonate, just leave it there, save it for another time, that's fine. But basically, we want you to start exactly where you are today. Just accept where you are and take one small move forward. If you need any support on this, please feel free to contact me. I offer a free career consultation. I also do help people to really dig into this and define their leadership style, as well as a whole wide range of career leadership solutions. So I bid you best of luck as you move forward in time, and don't forget to be true to you and to lead outside the box. Take good care.